Welcome one and all to episode 6 of Life at the Beggar's Tomb. The focus of this episode is on Odetta. She's a female musician known primarily as a folk artist. She was born in Alabama on New Year's Eve in 1930. Odetta and her mother, early on in Odetta's childhood, moved out to Los Angeles. Her mother had close ties to a puppet theater group that was instrumental in Odetta's development. She got to see firsthand people working together to make a business out of entertainment. At the age of 13, Odetta began voice lessons, and from that point on there was no looking back on her road to becoming the woman who Martin Luther King Jr. would later refer to as the Queen of Folk Music. Now allow me to connect a few dots in order to give you perspective on how I was lucky enough to learn of her. After a failed relationship, I left my hometown and my job as an assistant manager of a convenience store behind, and I thumbed my way to a much bigger college town of Morgantown. The year was 1996, 1 year after Jerry Garcia had passed away. I was 23 years old, the same age that Jerry was when the Grateful Dead came to be. So being as I looked to Jerry as essentially the role model of all my aspirations, I knew that this was the time in my life that I needed to start doing whatever it was I was going to get good at in order to be whatever it was I was going to be. Although I idolized Jerry and moreover adopted him as my absentee father, becoming a guitar player was ruled out by his greatness. His playing and the music that the Grateful Dead created was so above and beyond anything that I had imagined was possible, it quite literally opened up my mind to the possibility of God and heaven and all sorts of other worldly things. And I wanted to be great like that, but I didn't want to be a Jerry Garcia impersonator, and I felt that that's what I would have been had I gotten into music, because I would have gravitated to what he did because he was such a strong influence on me. Nonetheless, I studied Jerry, not only by listening to his recordings, but also through reading books about him, the Grateful Dead, and the lives and times of the people that surrounded him. I read his account of his friend Paul, who was a talented painter who had died tragically in a car crash. Jerry said it was this tragedy that ignited in him a sense of urgency to begin taking his life serious and begin working hard at his craft. Jerry himself was at a crossroads. He was teetering between music and painting, so he felt the need to pick a trade and let the other be the hobby. So since Jerry chose guitar, I felt that painting may perhaps be my destiny, imagining, perhaps, that my purpose was to fulfill the unrealized potentials of Jerry and Paul in the field of visual arts. The great part of that was that I could continue to idolize Jerry without the worry of it damaging the originality of my works, since it was in a totally separate field of art. Part of that idolization involved taking notice of what Jerry liked in music, and I began to delve into Jerry's solo career. I could not help but notice that he did a lot of Bob Dylan songs, and after hearing Jerry perform them, I became fond of those songs also. So my study of Jerry branched into the work of Bob Dylan. I bought Bob Dylan Bootleg series volumes 1, 2, and 3, and volume 1 was my awakening to the power of folk music. Growing up as a West Virginian, I felt as if I had to overcome my environment and not let it corrupt me with backwoods mannerisms and dialects. Feeling as though I'd typically been underestimated in my thinking power and potential by the educated people I'd hoped to impress in my early adulthood. I begrudgingly attributed this to my failure to hide the fact I was just a podunk West Virginian, no stranger to an outhouse and a spittoon. But Bob Dylan, whom I could instantly recognize to be super intelligent, embraced a raw, small town, nowhere, special America voice and used commonplace speech to point out how dumb and the pompous, phony Richie Riches who ruled the world were to not see how much simpler and better life would be without their so-called genius schemes. It struck me to the core, and coupled with certain Grateful Dead songs, it rekindled a love of rural music, real country music. But the most powerful track on that first CD to my ears was a poem read without musical accompaniment. It was called The Last Thoughts on Woody Guthrie. In that poem was the evidence that the young Bob Dylan in his early 20s had looked up to Woody Guthrie very much like I look up to Jerry. So Jerry, by admiring Dylan's work, had led me to Dylan, who led me to wind up buying a disc called The Greatest Songs of Woody Guthrie, which had a whole cast of interesting characters performing. That had a whole cast of interesting people performing songs that were written before my mom was born and that carried messages and truths that I thought were much more recent concepts. And best of all was the stark and blatant disregard of rank and social hierarchy by Woody, who made it very clear he had a lot more respect for a farmer than he did a big shot banker. And alas, via Jerry, then to Dylan, then to Woody, I was introduced to this black female folk artist with a voice that was graceful and smooth, yet mighty and powerful, that made me feel like it was quite capable of rattling down the walls of Jericho. Odetta performed 2 songs on that Woody Guthrie CD, and one of them was Pastures of Plenty. And the fact that Odetta was providing Woody's songs with a powerful voice, just like Jerry was providing Dylan's songs his power, I couldn't help but notice a pattern, and I connected a lineage. Within the lyrics of Woody's song, The Great Historical Bum, which Odetta did also on the Songs of Woody CD, Odetta's awesome voice introduced to me the concept that these attitudes, these voices of the non-mainstream, unpublished bums have been the unrecognized heroes winning the battle of good and evil ever since year 1. And it felt very true to me because I'd already felt that way about the Grateful Dead. And now I had learned that there was a whole generation before them who were different people but who were performing the same special roles. At the same time I was learning all these things about the history of American folk music and countercultural music, I was also studying the Bible for the first time as an adult. And I learned something that I hadn't remembered hearing in Sunday school, and that was the matter of King David being a man who played a stringed instrument. Reportedly, he played it so well that he was able to drive out bad spirits. Also, it mentions in the Bible that the king before him, Saul, had encountered some musicians whose music caused him to go into an altered state, and he began to prophesy in that altered state. So the power of music is duly noted in the Bible. So even though the word cult has been tossed around a bit in regards to the Grateful Dead and their following, I learned it is not a non-biblical concept to imagine that music can be a medium for a holy experience. I knew that if anyone was to ever suggest that this music was what was leading me away from the Bible, they were very much off the mark because in fact it was what led me to it. Yet had any sort of theology been attached to it at the onset, I would have been deterred for certain because of my disbelief in spiritual matters. In my mind, the most powerful force and final destination was death. So the Grateful Dead, at least on the surface of just the band's name, seemed to be cynical and skeptical of something more powerful. Only after a slow progression into their work did I find statements in support of biblical text, and ultimately even Jesus Christ. However, in Jerry's solo work, the songs of commitment to the forces of good over evil were not disguised, nor mixed in with other songs that reflected an attitude of someone without belief. By the time I was able to hear a full album of Odetta, my life situation had changed. My first child had been born, and his mother and I were in Cleveland, Ohio. I was happy to discover a CD at the library that had perhaps 20 or more songs recorded early on in Odetta's career, as well as a more modern period recording with a lot less songs. Given just the sound of her voice, I wasn't surprised to find that spirituals were part of her repertoire. Now, as a true believer, I delighted in what I discovered in these treasures immediately. Not only were they testaments of faith, the greatness of her delivery was a testament to the validity of her faith, because that power that she put forth was unlike anything I'd heard. Now, I had to wonder why, in this world that seemed so oppressively religious before I had found faith, was the music like this and this lady? Why was she not a superstar? And all this something that someone could not help to already know just by being around televisions and radios. Yet actually, by this time, I had already realized that the Christian faith, as it is presented superficially in pop culture, it was presented as a religion that in practice continually condemns and restricts behavior. Yet in the words of Jesus, spoken in the Gospels, it was passing judgment that he condemns. When asked directly which of God's commandments was most important, he said it was love. That's something someone should do, rather than giving a commandment that was the condemnation of behaviors. Now in all you've just heard are the bricks and the foundation and the purpose of the beggar's tomb. I focus on artistes whom I find light, that are buried under the heaps of pop culture that have been dropped upon these decades of life that I've experienced. And within what I studied, I'd found out that Odetta may have been disassociated from mainstream culture, but she did have connections to modern culture. There are people who are well known. Now, I mentioned earlier her link to Martin Luther King Jr. and his fondness of her. I also learned that the bassist that accompanied her on many songs was Bill Lee, and he had a little boy who traveled along with him. And he was to become a well-known movie director, Spike Lee. I guess one could think that's all a crazy coincidence, but I believe that is almost certainly a result of being exposed to greatness and having a foundation of meaningful artwork that promoted justice and overcoming oppression, and that lended its support via recognition and compassion towards those who struggle in the face of it. I learned that Odetta most certainly had opportunities to use her voice to escape the whole class that she was in, the whole bottom side of society, and she could have rubbed elbows with those who were sheltered high above her class and within the world of opera. But as I gained new access to her via the internet, when I was finally able to have it in my home, I was very pleased and inspired to hear her say in her own words, "I like to lend my energy to those who are, as I say, on the firing line." And I love this quote, and the way she gave it was way better. Access to the internet gave me access to Odetta tour dates. When I found out that she was going to be performing in Hagerstown, Maryland, just a few hour drive away, I had to go. Having had originally associated her with Woody's generation, I hadn't thought that seeing her live would ever be a possibility. She was, however, closer in age to Dylan, although still a full decade older than Bob Dylan, and therefore beyond retirement age nonetheless, and I did not want to miss this opportunity. But we couldn't find a babysitter for that day. In one interview I saw with Odetta, and I can't recall if it was before or after the concert that I'd hoped to see in Hagerstown, Odetta stated that she felt that a broad misconception across society was that the whole idea that you should leave your kids behind to go out for a good time, the big night out in the town, get the babysitter, and that should be your big time. She thought that the big time should be when you have the whole family together and the whole family be included. Well, in our little tiny family, having a babysitter was very rarely achieved anyhow, and very rarely did we have these nights out, so we went to that small auditorium, 1 year old included. We arrived very early because I was so stoked, so conscious of the fact that I was going to be in the presence of greatness, and so therefore God was surely going to be looking upon us, and who knows what sort of predestined meeting and conversation might take place with Odetta. When we arrived, we had to wait outside the auditorium, and it hadn't even been opened yet. All the insistence upon coming to this concert had been my idea. Actually, I have to say that the mother of my children was almost a little jealous. Well, she always was, just thought I was, what's you with you and Odetta, and as if it was anything relationship-wise. Of course it wasn't. But so I was one that insisted on all this, and so it was my duty to try and make sure that this wasn't a terrible experience. And so as the stresses of being in a non-fun for a baby environment began to muster, it was also now my duty to help lift spirits. So as much as I was able to, I tried to make the activity of walking around outside the auditorium on that small town campus seem a little bit fun. Eventually the auditorium was opened, and immediately we went to the doors because this was a general admission show, and another part of the reason that we needed to get there early, because I wanted to be up there close and personal with Odetta, as close and personal as we could possibly be. Well, when we approached the people who were opening the doors, they seemed surprised a bit. They were not concert production professionals, they were college faculty, and they hadn't expected a 20-something dreadlock couple and a baby. And it was with abundant awkwardness that teetered on between them feeling obligated to treat us as welcome or make us feel as though we were rude to have intruded upon their expectations. As more people slowly gathered, the number soon became adequate for everyone to realize that there was only one elephant in the room. Therefore, this was not going to be a zoo, and after a few mutterings amongst themselves, the others in attendance, most of them most likely professors and spouses and other high society educated people who felt an automatic righteousness just for having had many conversations about the civil rights movement and knowing the players in it, that which, of course, they were in full support of, and that lifted them to the next level of righteousness. Therefore, when one of them showed courage enough to say, "You brought a baby to this?" in a cynical manner, their boldness was received well among them, and all eyes were upon us. We were no stranger to hateful looks, and we had already had plenty of those types of looks of disapproval for our choices on what was suitable for a baby's life. We traveled through 26 states before our son had turned 1 year old, but this was not a gas station in the sticks on a Saturday night among rednecks. This was at a gathering of people who'd arranged to bring Odetta into their social club list of accomplishments. An accomplishment that meant that now they not only knew about the civil rights movement, they were a part of the civil rights movement, and they would have snapshots up on their educated walls that would forever prove it. And I knew it was my place to answer these questions, to provide security against these judgments. And so I quickly explained that we were experienced travelers, and I mentioned that we'd made a trek clear out to Oklahoma for Woody Guthrie's folk festival when our baby was half this age. Therefore, this concert was just a walk in our backyard. Well, I soon realized that this was not a Woody Guthrie crowd, when their expressions and brows showed that I'd only further substantiated that we were vagrants that had bred a baby vagrant. So another question arose. Are you intending on having the baby inside the listening area of the auditorium while the performance is going on? A simple yes came back to that question, and the eyes were upon us. Both my baby and his mom looked to me in discomfort, because even a 1-year-old could sense so much negativity, and it is a natural reaction of any kind of discomfort for a 1-year-old to cry. And so I, with that, tried to be happy and confident smile, and I looked to my baby boy to ease him, but his lips quivered, and a little wow was produced. "It's all right, buddy, it's all right," I reassured as I reached out to him where his mom reached to me, and she gave me the boy. And I took him in my arms, and her eyes were humiliated and enraged at both me and all the people who were now glaring at us. Sensing that they might be well on their way to producing the remedy to their problem by chasing out the elephant, they kept glaring. I took him in my arms, and I began calmly bouncing him and giving a loving hold of comfort as he snuffed back sadness, and then another pounced upon us with a question. "Don't you think it was a bad idea to bring the baby here?" We had no other option except to miss this concert, and this might be the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me to see Odetta. Now their eyes were even more confused and angry, and something that they just couldn't understand. Now, why would these vagrant people be in attendance to this educated woman's concert and be excited to see it? Now the looks of confusion turned to disbelief, and a question was spoke across the room towards the lady who'd opened the door originally. Did they pay to get in here? They had felt that they'd realized what this really was. This was an attempt by insane vagrants to prey upon their liberal righteousness and charitable characters, to steal the honor of their presence and pull God knows what other theft as well. Now my baby's mom spoke up in her own defense, saying, "Yes, we paid with authority." Being made to feel that this was a bad decision had bothered her and had her thoughts mad thoughts directed towards me, but the act that she was an idiot intruder pissed her off and made her mad at the people. And that man, he looked only to the lady to wait for the answer, because he did not want to look towards the voodoo witch lady's eyes that he'd awoken. Yes, they bought tickets, she replied to him apologetically as she shrugged with a gesture to say, I don't know what to do. But one of them knew just what to do, and they were going to take this bull by the horns. So they stepped out of their place behind us in line as we waited for the auditorium, the inner auditorium doors to open, and they marched right up to us and they said, listen, if there's a sound from your child during this concert presentation, you're going to need to leave. Everyone here has tickets. We all paid for this concert presentation, so you have no right to ruin this for everyone else. And with that sassy heroine from their ranks, they all chuckled victoriously amongst themselves, because they were sure that now they would have the opportunity to have a reason to push out the people who they just sort of ridiculed in all of it. But we went on in, and we got in the front row because we were right there in the front waiting for the doors to open. And then we got there and we put ourselves in the front row. And meanwhile, my baby's mom she was nervous by all this. And my little baby was still a little bit nervous. And then the music started and the lights dimmed. When Odetta came out on stage, she was wheeled out in a wheelchair. And as she got to the stage, she got up to walk towards the microphone. She walked to the microphone. Her piano player who wheeled her there to the edge of the stage, he pushed her wheelchair on over to the microphone. She sat back down in the wheelchair. The microphone was lowered to her voice. He returned his piano, and the concert began, and the lights were dim. And she opened up with Kumbaya, a song that a lot of people know it from camp or other places like that. Odetta gave an introduction to the song, explaining that it was originally from Africa. And Kumbaya means come by here. So come by here, my Lord, was what the song meant. And towards the very end of it, my little boy, he gave out a sound. And all the eyes, they widened. I could feel them behind us, and this was the moment that they might have, and it was at the end of her song, so they were going to have that little break in the action to which to come and usher us out quietly without disturbing any of the actual performances. But as soon as that song ended, Odetta said, that was the greatest amen I've heard in a long time from that little baby's voice. That was so pleasing to my ears. Now all eyes knew not what to do, except to be stumped. And then from that point on, it was our concert. And there was no problems with our baby. And once our spirits were lifted, I think his spirit was lifted, and the whole day went great. Not only did I get to sense up close and personal the power of Odetta's voice, but also the power of Odetta and who she was. Now, for this next part, and we were going along with this episode, as you can see, because this is a special episode, I tried to do an Odetta song because, for good reason, her music's still under copyright, and I don't want this episode to fall into somebody else's copyright holdings. So how am I going to muster the way to summon the spirit of Odetta, being as she was a vocalist primarily with her music, and I haven't access to her voice except for the fact that anytime I heard a song she did, after I'd heard her do it, structured any of the songs she did, I structured it the way she did it and tried to push it that way. So the Pastures of Plenty song, which was written by Guthrie, that she performed, that's the one that I'm going to present to you. This is my presentation. Thanks for hearing that. Now, if you haven't heard Odetta do the song, you can always look up her version of it. It's much better, of course, and you're starting to see some connections come in, and it's only going to keep connecting, and I hope you like it. And that's the end of this one. Till next time, thank you.